The pistol never left Tully's hand, not even when the man across from him dropped the axe and knelt in the dirt. It was 1944, somewhere in the dust-choked stretch between Abilene and nowhere, and the Texas sun had no mercy. The prisoner, barefoot, gaunt, a Japanese soldier barely older than a boy, had wandered too close to the ranch's fence line. Rules were clear. Escapees were to be shot. But something about the way the young man looked up, no fear, just quiet resolve, made Tully hesitate. Behind him, a dust devil rose across the plains. His horse stirred, the barn creaked, and the Japanese prisoner, squinting in the sun, spoke the only English word he seemed to know: water. What happened next would baffle Tully for the rest of his life, because in a war defined by lies, cruelty, and revenge, a moment of trust would come not with a handshake, but with a rusted bucket, a shared silence, and a choice that would one day save his life. It was hard to say exactly when Riku first arrived at the ranch, but Tully remembered the heat that day, the kind that clung to the skin like wet cotton, even in the morning. They'd sent him with a clipboard and an escort, 2 MPs sweating in their helmets, who handed over the papers like they were dropping off a sack of fertilizer. "One Japanese prisoner, assigned for ranch work, low risk," they said, as if it meant anything. Riku bowed once, not quite meeting Tully's eyes. He was thin, almost frail-looking, with hands that looked more suited to rice fields than war. Tully didn't say a word. He just spat in the dust and motioned toward the barn with a tilt of his chin. That's where it began. Tully didn't trust him, not even close. After Pearl Harbor, there weren't many Texans who could stomach the idea of a Japanese soldier standing on American soil, let alone on their land. But Tully's mistrust ran deeper than politics. He had seen the trenches in France, had watched friends cough blood through mustard gas lungs, had heard the distant whistles before the shelling came. He carried that war like a limp, visible and invisible all at once. When the Second War came, and young men were shipped off again, Tully had already done his part. He stayed behind this time, older, slower, tasked with filling the labor gaps any way he could. That's how the prisoner came to him, not by choice, but by necessity. Riku, for his part, said almost nothing. He followed instructions, mimicked movements, and worked with a kind of steady silence that bordered on eerie. When handed a rake, he raked. When told to sweep the stalls, he swept. He ate slowly, carefully, like each bite had to be earned. And though the camp-issued work clothes hung loose on his frame, Tully noticed his movements were precise, methodical, almost meditative. He didn't know it yet, but Riku had been a farmer's son in Hiroshima. Drafted at 19, trained in a muddy hillside camp, and captured less than a year later after a naval skirmish left him stranded and wounded. He hadn't seen his home since, and every morning in Texas, when the sun cracked over the plains, he remembered the shape of the mountains behind his father's field. There was something about the ranch that made everything louder. The wind through the grass sounded like whispering. The creak of the barn door was practically a sermon. Silence wasn't a void here, it was a presence. And that silence stretched between Tully and Riku like a taut rope, always one wrong step away from snapping. There was no one else on the property most days, just 2 men from opposite ends of the earth, bound together by war and fences. And yet the land didn't care. The horses needed feeding. The gates needed mending. The well needed checking. These tasks, dry and routine, became the fabric of their days. Slowly, the silence between them grew less hostile. One day, Riku pointed at a saddle left outside, shaking his head. "Rain," he said simply. Tully grunted and moved it. Another time, Riku gestured toward a loose chicken wire. He fixed it without being asked. Nothing dramatic, just small things, useful things. Still, Tully slept with the rifle beside his bed. Still, he watched the horizon for signs of anything strange, because deep down he didn't trust silence, not after everything he'd seen. He knew too well how quiet the world got just before a grenade landed. And yet there was something in Riku's stillness that didn't feel like a threat. It felt like waiting. Texas itself had a way of pressing on the soul, the long, empty stretches of land where heat shimmered like ghosts, the way the dust clung to your boots and didn't let go. It was a place where noise didn't survive long. And in that silence, both men found themselves confronting not each other, but everything they'd carried into that silence. Regret, loss, grief wrapped in loyalty. They would not speak of it, but they would live it day after day as the wind bent the prairie grass and the horses grazed in the distance, unconcerned with who was American and who was Japanese. The war had brought them to the same plot of land, but the land, indifferent and eternal, was what forced them to stand still and listen, to themselves, to each other, to a silence that would soon speak louder than either man expected. Camp Hereford lay about 10 miles west of town, carved into the flat expanse like a man-made scar across prairie brush and red clay. It was the largest Japanese POW camp in Texas, but you wouldn't know it by looking at a map. No one put up signs. The wire fences hummed in the wind, punctuated by wooden towers where guards stood like statues, bored but armed. Inside, the camp was orderly. Barracks laid out like teeth in a jaw, a mess hall that never stopped smelling of powdered eggs and weak coffee, and a command post staffed by men in pressed khakis who balanced war protocol with rural pragmatism. The Geneva Convention was enforced, but loosely, like a belt cinched just tight enough to hold things together without cutting off circulation. Prisoners were classified by risk, high, moderate, and low. Riku, with his quiet demeanor and lack of rank, was deemed low risk and shuffled into the labor program without ceremony. It was a system built less on trust than necessity. The war had taken men from the fields and ranches, leaving gaps the government filled with what it had: enemy hands. Across Texas, Japanese POWs repaired fences, tilled cotton rows, milked cows, and shoveled manure under the watchful eyes of farmers who had lost sons to the Pacific. Some refused to take them. Others, like Tully, agreed with a grunt and a signature, figuring a man who dug ditches without complaint was worth more than a broken tractor. Out in town, reactions to the POWs ran the spectrum. At the diner near the train tracks, you could hear men muttering over black coffee and greasy plates. Japs shouldn't be fed, let alone paid. A shopkeeper posted a sign that read, "No POWs allowed," even though none were allowed off the trucks without escort, but others watched from porches with uneasy fascination. They were curious. They'd never seen a Japanese man up close before, only caricatures from newspaper cartoons with slanted eyes and devilish grins. What they saw instead were boys, thin, sunburned, quiet, men with calloused hands and skin darkened by days under the Texas sky. No devils, just workers. Riku said little during these early days, but his silence held weight. At night, lying in his cot inside Barracks 7, he would trace the edge of a scrap of cloth he kept in his shirt pocket. It was from his brother's uniform, a frayed edge from a tunic lost the day American planes strafed their convoy near Saipan. Riku had survived by crawling into a drainage ditch and holding his breath until his lungs ached. His brother hadn't made it out of the truck. In dreams, he still saw his brother's face lit by firelight, mouth open in warning or pain. It was never clear which. Captivity was not the shame he'd been taught to expect. It was worse. It was survival without meaning, and yet work gave him structure. He woke when the bell rang, lined up for head count, and rode in the back of a flatbed truck that smelled of hay and rust. He observed more than he spoke. Tully's limp, the way the horse favored its left hind leg, the way Texas light changed color just before dusk, going gold, then copper, then a bruised purple. These were things he memorized, because memory was the only part of him the war hadn't taken. Tully hadn't asked for a Japanese prisoner, not specifically. He'd just said he needed help. When the paperwork came stamped with kanji and military insignia, he'd stared at it for a long moment, then folded it once and tucked it into his pocket like a receipt for something he wasn't sure he wanted. Every time Riku set foot on his land, something in Tully coiled tight. It wasn't fear, it was something older. A resentment passed down in letters and telegrams, in the way the radio barked about Pacific Islands like they were distant, cursed planets. To Tully, the war hadn't ended. It had just changed uniforms. But out on the land, time didn't care for uniforms. It was measured in fence posts and sunsets, in how fast a man could fill a trough or dig a trench before the sun cooked the back of his neck. And slowly, beneath the weight of this shared routine, even hatred began to sweat. Camp Hereford still loomed behind them at the end of every day, its fences tight and unyielding. But for those hours between sunrise and dusk, there was no camp. There was only the dirt, the sky, and the work that needed doing. And that, for now, was enough. The heat came down like punishment. By mid-morning, the metal of the gate was too hot to touch, and the air shimmered in waves over the fields. Tully moved slower than usual, dragging one leg behind him like a stubborn mule, while Riku worked in silence, stacking bales of hay with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had long ago learned to keep his head down. They hadn't spoken all day, not really, though Tully had grunted once when the wheelbarrow tipped. But as noon approached, something shifted. Riku staggered. It was brief, just a hitch in his step, a small falter of the knees, but it caught Tully's eye. The boy had stripped down to his undershirt, skin slick with sweat, face pale beneath the sun. Then he dropped. Not hard, not like a man dying, more like a puppet whose strings had been snipped. Tully cursed under his breath, looked around as if someone might be watching, then reached into the saddlebag and pulled out his canteen. He hesitated for half a second, then tossed it underhand through the dust. "Drink," he muttered, loud enough to hear, but soft enough to pretend he hadn't meant it. Riku caught the canteen clumsily, eyes wide with surprise. He didn't thank him. He didn't need to. The gesture itself was already a crack in the wall. That night, as the sun bled out behind the hills, the barn held a heavy stillness. The horses shifted in their stalls, stamping and snorting at shadows. Tully was patching a beam when the sound came, sharp, dry, unmistakable. A rattle, not the kind from tools or carts, the kind that meant death. He turned just in time to see it, coiled, ready, a western diamondback, its tail twitching like a warning bell. One step more, and it would strike. He froze, but Riku didn't. The prisoner moved fast, faster than Tully thought possible, snatching up a broken rake handle and swinging it down in a single brutal arc. The snake's head crumpled against the dirt with a sickening pop. It twitched once, then went still. Tully didn't say anything, neither did Riku, but the horse behind them let out a long, nervous exhale, as if it understood what had just been avoided. Later, sitting on the steps outside the bunkhouse, Tully lit a cigarette with hands that still trembled slightly. Riku sat 10 feet away, cross-legged in the dirt, staring up at the stars. Neither spoke for a long time. You seen one of those before? Tully finally asked. Riku nodded once. Yes, in book. Tully grunted. Then, after a pause, You moved quick. Another nod. Horse would die. It wasn't trust yet, but it was something. The next morning, Tully found the rake handle propped against the barn wall, cleaned of blood. He stared at it for a moment, then turned and got on with the day. Silence had been their language for a week now, but something had shifted. It was no longer filled with suspicion. Now it held the weight of shared experience. They didn't need to speak much. The way Riku handed over tools before being asked, the way Tully left the barn door unlatched at night. It was all part of a slow, wordless dance, the kind where even a misstep meant something real. The town still watched, of course, farmhands passing by on their way to other fields, a few locals who muttered in church pews or at gas stations, wondering why a man like Tully, a veteran, would let one of them onto his land. But Tully didn't answer to them. The only ones watching now were the horses, and they weren't talking. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from all corners of the world. If you're finding this story as compelling as we are, go ahead and click the like button to help others discover it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel below this video and tap the notification bell so we can keep bringing you more forgotten stories like this one. Every click helps us keep the archives alive. That week, the work felt lighter, the heat didn't relent, and the ground didn't soften, but something in the space between the two men had eased. The barn was safer now, not because the snake was dead, but because someone had chosen to protect it without being asked. And in a world where lines were drawn in blood and loyalty, that kind of decision echoed far louder than any salute. Tully had never questioned the stories. They were handed down like tools, passed from the trenches of France to the bar stools of Texas. Sharp-edged tales of enemies who fought dirty, who didn't value life, who would slit your throat while smiling. His father had fought in the Spanish-American War. His uncle came back shell-shocked from Verdun, and the boys he knew from town, the ones who went off to Guadalcanal and didn't come back, had sealed the rest. Japs, they called them, like they were insects, not men. That word had been baked into Tully's understanding of the war before he'd ever seen a single Japanese face. But then came Riku. The boy didn't match the myth. He didn't sneer. He didn't threaten. He didn't so much as flinch when the hammer cracked too loud against the fence post. Instead, he nodded when given a task, bowed slightly when taking tools, and, more than once, finished work before Tully even realized he'd asked. There was no arrogance in him, no heat, just presence, measured, observant, deliberate. One afternoon, as they replaced a rotted beam in the barn, Tully cursed and jerked his hand back. A splinter, long and angry, embedded beneath the skin of his palm. He swore under his breath and reached for his pocket-knife to dig it out. That's when Riku stepped forward. He didn't ask. He simply opened his own hand, showing a folded scrap of cloth, and made a small motion. "May I?" Tully hesitated. Then, with a grunt, he handed the hand over. Riku worked quietly, extracting the splinter with the steady patience of someone who'd done it 100 times. When it was out, he wrapped the cloth tightly around Tully's hand. The cloth smelled faintly of pine tar and something floral. Not perfume, but memory. Riku nodded once and went back to work. Tully stood there, stunned by the simplicity of it. The boy had touched him, willingly, gently, and the world hadn't fallen apart. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't pull away either. Work does something to men. It wears them down, but it also binds them. The long hours, the sweat, the shared silence, it erodes judgment faster than any sermon. As the days stretched on, the rhythm of labor became a kind of language between them. When the wheelbarrow stuck in the ruts, Riku lifted without being asked. When Tully reached for the feed, Riku was already holding the sack open. They didn't speak much, but something was being said day by day. The townsfolk still hadn't forgotten who Riku was. A few times, Tully caught a look from the driver who delivered feed. The glances said it all. "You know what he is, right?" And Tully did. But what he was no longer matched what Tully saw. What he saw was a boy who never slouched, who never complained, who stood straighter than most grown men when he picked up a shovel. There was dignity in the way he moved, even when covered in sweat and dust. At night, Tully sometimes sat with a cup of coffee on the porch, watching the moon lift itself over the low hills. He could hear Riku in the bunkhouse, moving quietly, never slamming doors, never making a fuss. It unsettled him how easily the rhythm of this boy's presence had folded into the shape of the ranch. The old stories didn't prepare him for this. They taught him how to fire a rifle, how to tighten a perimeter, how to speak with suspicion. But they didn't say anything about what to do when the enemy saved your horse, mended your fence, or wrapped your hand without being told. And so the myths began to crack, not with a thunderclap, but like old wood beneath weather, slowly, silently, and with no way back. The morning it happened was so still that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Tully woke before dawn, the kind of wakefulness that came not from habit but from unease. The ranch had its own rhythm: roosters, the scrape of boots, the sound of Riku filling the troughs, but that morning something was missing. The quiet was too perfect. He stepped out onto the porch and listened. The pump out by the well gave a hollow, empty choke. No water. That was when the first flicker of worry crept into his chest. He limped out to the pasture, following the fence line, eyes scanning for the boy. The air was heavy and gray with heat, the kind that pressed on a man's lungs. At the far corner of the property, where the barbed wire sagged near the creek bed, he saw it. The fence had been cut clean through. His stomach tightened. A clean cut meant intent, disobedience, escape. But even as the thought formed, it didn't feel right. Riku wasn't the running type. He was careful, deliberate. If he was gone, there was a reason. Tully checked the barn. Empty. The tools were in place. The canteen was gone. He felt anger rise, sharp, defensive, like it was covering something else. He grabbed his rifle and started down the slope toward the creek. Dust rose around his boots with every step, the air shimmering like glass. He found him after a mile, knee-deep in the water, filling a wooden bucket with slow, practiced movements. Riku turned when he heard the crunch of boots behind him. The boy's face was calm, not guilty, not afraid, just steady. "What the hell you think you're doing?" Tully barked. The rifle came up before he even thought about it. Riku didn't flinch. "Well dry," he said simply, his English thick but clear. He nodded toward the ranch. "Horses need water." The words hit Tully harder than he expected. For a second his mind split in two. One half, the soldier's half, saw the broken fence, the prisoner outside bounds, the rules that said a man should pull the trigger without hesitation. The other half, the one that had learned to read silence and sweat and good work, saw something else. A man who had disobeyed not to flee, but to save. "Drop the bucket," Tully said, though his voice lacked the iron it once had. Riku obeyed, slowly, setting it in the grass. The water rippled, clear as glass. Tully's finger hovered on the trigger. The moment stretched between them like wire, thin and trembling. Then, without quite realizing why, he lowered the rifle. "God damn it," he muttered. "You could have been shot." Riku tilted his head slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "No run," he said softly. "No fear." For a moment, Tully just stared at him, the calm in his eyes, the sweat dripping down his temples, the bucket half full beside him. Then he bent, picked up the handle, and together they carried the water back. Neither spoke on the walk home. The silence wasn't the heavy kind anymore. It was alive, full of something neither could name. When they reached the ranch, Tully fixed the fence himself. He could have reported the break, written it up as a violation, but instead he twisted the wire shut and buried the evidence beneath dust. That night, when the horses drank from the refilled troughs, he caught Riku's gaze across the barn. The boy gave a small nod, almost invisible, as if to say he understood the price of what had just passed between them. Tully nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't friendship. It was something else, something that had no name in any language either of them spoke. Later, lying awake in the dark, Tully realized the strangest thing of all. For the first time since the war began, he hadn't acted out of fear. He'd acted out of faith, and that, more than anything, terrified him. Sleep came late that night, heavy and fractured. When it finally did, it came not as rest, but as return. Tully found himself back in the jungle, the one he'd never stepped foot in, but had lived in his mind for years. Guadalcanal. It was always Guadalcanal. He smelled the rot, the wet heat, the faint metallic tang of blood that clung to letters sent home from his cousin Dean. They'd grown up together, wrestled in the dirt as boys, fought side by side in their own small ways before the war tore them apart. Dean had gone first, eager and grinning beneath the brim of his new uniform. "We'll whip 'em quick," he'd said. But the letters that followed told another story. Rain that never stopped, men vanishing in the trees, nights alive with the whine of mosquitoes and the sound of something worse. Then the letters stopped. Tully woke, drenched in sweat, the air in his small bedroom thick as the jungle in his dream. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, feeling that familiar dull ache rise in his chest. The ache of knowing the body had never come home. The ache of knowing the man he blamed for it, the faceless Japanese soldier, now slept 100 feet away in his bunkhouse. He rose, stepped onto the porch, and lit a cigarette. The night air was cooler, the stars clearer than he deserved. Somewhere across the yard, a soft scraping sound carried through the dark. Riku was awake too. Through the half-open window of the bunkhouse, Tully saw him sitting cross-legged on the floor, hunched over something small that glinted in the lamplight. The boy's hands moved with delicate precision, carving a sliver of wood with a pocket-knife. His movements were slow, patient, like someone tending a wound. When he turned it in the light, Tully saw what it was, a bird. Not finished yet, just wings and outline, but the shape was there. It struck Tully as strange, carving something that could fly when you couldn't even leave the fence. He wondered if that was why he did it. In his mind, Dean's face flickered again. The telegram had come in 1943. "Missing in action," it said, which was just the Army's polite way of saying, "Gone forever." Tully's mother had cried, his father had sworn, Tully had clenched his fists and promised he'd never forgive the people responsible. But sitting there now, cigarette smoke curling into the night, he realized how little he actually knew of those people. He'd built them out of fear and rumor, given them horns and shadows. And now one of them was carving a bird in his barn. Inside the bunkhouse, Riku paused and held the carving close to his chest. He whispered something under his breath, soft, rhythmic, almost a prayer. Then he set the bird down and lay back on the cot. Riku's dreams were not of Texas or even of the war. They were of home, His father's fields outside Hiroshima, the smell of earth after rain, his brother's laughter echoing through the rice paddies. Then the noise of planes, the fire, the smell of oil and death, his brother's voice calling out once, and then silence. In that silence, Riku had learned a terrible truth. Sometimes survival was not victory. Sometimes it was simply endurance. That was the difference between them, though neither man could have said it aloud. Tully carried ghosts born of distance and loss. Riku carried ghosts born of survival. Both were prisoners of what the war had taken, and neither knew yet how to forgive themselves for still breathing. Before dawn, Tully stubbed out the cigarette and looked toward the bunkhouse one last time. The lamp had gone out, but he could still see the faint silhouette of the carved bird resting on the windowsill, wings half-shaped, waiting. He thought about Dean, about the jungle that had swallowed him whole, and about the boy asleep in that bunk who might have once been on the other side of his cousin's rifle. He didn't know if the world could make sense of that, but he knew this much. He was tired of hating ghosts. The storm rolled in fast, one of those Texas tempests that felt biblical. The horizon darkened until it was almost green, the air thick and electric. You could smell the rain before you saw it. But it wasn't rain that came first. It was light. A bolt split the sky in two, white and jagged, striking somewhere beyond the far pasture. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then came the sound, a deep, rolling crack that seemed to shake the earth itself. Tully was in the barn, checking on the horses, when the first smell of smoke reached him. Not wood smoke, grass fire, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. He limped to the doorway and looked out toward the fields. A thin orange line was already crawling across the prairie, whipped forward by wind that howled like a living thing. His heart sank. One dry spark was all it took out here. He shouted for Riku, but the wind swallowed the name whole. He moved fast, grabbing a bucket and dousing the hay near the barn door. The horses were screaming, stamping, wild-eyed. Lightning cracked again, closer this time. The flames were growing faster than he could think, racing toward the fence. He ran into the stall, tugging at the rope of the nearest mare. She resisted, thrashing in panic. The rope burned across his palm, reopening the wound that had only just healed. "Easy, girl," he muttered through gritted teeth. But the horse reared, knocking him backward into the post. His head struck wood. The world spun. When he came to, the air was thick and gray. Smoke filled the barn, turning every breath into fire. He coughed, tried to rise, and failed. Somewhere in the haze, the horse screamed again. He heard the roof timbers pop, the sound of death closing in. Then, through the smoke, a figure emerged, bareheaded, face blackened with soot. Riku. The boy didn't hesitate. He moved through the fire like he had done it before, pulling Tully up by the arm. His sleeve caught flame. He didn't stop. He slung Tully's good arm over his shoulder and dragged him toward the door. Every step was a battle. Heat, wind, the collapsing wood above. Outside, the night had turned orange. The prairie was burning, a wave of flame sweeping toward the horizon. They stumbled clear just as part of the roof gave way. The sound was a roar, 1,000 dry boards screaming as they burned. Tully fell to the dirt, gasping. Riku turned back once, as if to make sure no animal was left inside. He was coughing hard, his eyes streaming, but his grip on Tully's arm never loosened. When they finally reached the water trough, both men plunged their hands in, the cold shocking after the heat. The horses, freed, stood trembling in the open field. Half the pasture was gone, blackened to ash, but the barn still stood, half charred, half saved. Tully stared at the devastation, then at Riku, The boy's shirt was scorched. Blisters were already forming along his forearm where the fire had caught him. His breathing was ragged, but he said nothing. He just sat beside Tully, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last of the flames licked the night. Tully's throat felt raw, part smoke, part something heavier. He turned to Riku, words thick and unfamiliar in his mouth. "Thanks," he said finally. Just that. Riku didn't look up right away. When he did, he nodded once, small, almost shy, and replied, "Yes." It wasn't much, but the sound of it, 2 syllables shared between them, cut through the silence more cleanly than any apology or prayer ever could. The wind began to shift, carrying the smell of rain now, faint but real. It would come soon, enough to smother what was left of the fire. But the damage was done, and something else had changed too, something neither man could rebuild with wood or wire. That night, Tully couldn't sleep. The word he'd spoken echoed in his head, simple and impossible. Thanks. A word he'd never thought he'd give to the man he once pointed a gun at. But when he looked out the window, the prairie glowing faintly under the first drops of rain, he realized it wasn't just gratitude, it was surrender. The quiet kind that comes when a man stops fighting the truth that's been right in front of him all along. The fire was out by morning, but the smoke lingered like a ghost. Thin wisps drifted over the charred fields, carrying with them the smell of ruin and survival. Camp officials arrived by noon, 2 officers in starched uniforms who stepped from their truck with clipboards and questions sharpened like bayonets. Regulation demanded an inquiry. A prisoner had crossed a perimeter. A civilian had been injured. Property had been damaged. Someone would need to answer. Tully met them at the barn, one arm wrapped in a bandage, his hat pulled low. They asked him what happened, and he told them a story, a version anyway. He said he had sent Riku to fetch water before the storm rolled in, said he didn't expect the fire, said the boy had returned when called, and that the cut in the fence must have been from years back. The officers looked at each other, made a note, then nodded. No further questions. The lie slipped through the cracks like rain through old floorboards. But it didn't sit easy. Not because it stained him, he'd told worse lies in his time, but because it made something plain. He hadn't lied to protect Riku from punishment. He'd lied because, somewhere between the work and the fire and the word thanks, the boy had stopped being a prisoner. Later that evening, after the officers had driven away and the ash had settled into the soil, Tully walked into the bunkhouse to check on the damage. The cot was made, the tools cleaned and lined along the wall. Riku wasn't there. Out working, maybe, or sitting by the creek. But on the small wooden table near the cot, something new sat waiting. A carving. It was a horse, small, smooth, the size of a man's hand. Its legs were folded beneath it in a resting pose, head bowed slightly, not in pain, but in peace. Every line had been shaped with care. No flourishes, no vanity, just stillness. Tully picked it up, turned it in his hands. He didn't need to ask what it meant. In Japan, a horse resting with folded legs symbolized safety, even surrender. Not defeat, just the rare, precious moment when vigilance could soften. In Texas, it meant something too. A ranch horse that lay down without fear trusted its ground, its keeper, its luck. This horse was not fleeing. It was not fighting. It had simply, finally, allowed itself to rest. Tully sat down on the cot, the wood creaking under his weight. He held the horse gently, as if it might vanish. The gesture pierced deeper than words ever could. Riku hadn't asked for anything, not praise, not protection. But he'd given Tully something Tully didn't know he'd needed. A mirror. He saw himself in the quiet loyalty of that carved horse, in its scars, in its restraint, in its refusal to bolt even when the fire came. Outside, the wind had shifted again. The rain had done its job. The land, blackened though it was, would one day sprout green again. Tully stayed on the cot long after the sun had gone down. He didn't light a lamp, didn't speak. He simply sat with the carving in his hand, the bunkhouse silent around him. The war had taught him how to survive. But this moment, this stillness, was teaching him something else. How to see, how to listen, how to finally begin to understand. The war ended not with fireworks, but with silence. Word came down through the radios in the spring of 1945, and by summer, Camp Hereford began to empty. One truck at a time, the prisoners were processed and repatriated, sent back to a homeland most of them hadn't seen in years, and many feared no longer existed. There were no ceremonies, no goodbyes, just names checked off a list and men herded toward waiting trains like livestock. Riku was gone before Tully could say a word. He found out one morning when he stepped into the bunkhouse and the cot was empty. No folded blanket, no carving on the table, just dust where the boots used to sit and a faint impression in the mattress. Tully stood there for a long while, unsure if he felt disappointment or relief, maybe both. He returned to the ranch work because that was what he knew. The land didn't change for the end of war. Fences still needed mending. Animals still needed care. But nothing moved the same. It was like someone had shifted the rhythm of things by half a beat, and now every step felt a little off. The bunkhouse stayed empty. He didn't take on another worker. Couldn't. Years passed in the way years do, quietly, invisibly. The world moved on. Wars gave way to ceasefires, headlines changed, people married, people died. But some things don't change just because the paper says peace has been declared. Tully aged slowly. Wrinkles came around the eyes, then the hands. The limp deepened. The barn was rebuilt after the fire, a little sturdier this time. The prairie grass grew back over the scorched fields, erasing the line where the fire had licked toward death. But the carving stayed. He kept it on the windowsill in the kitchen, right where the morning light hit it best. A folded-legged horse, quiet and still. Every now and then he picked it up and turned it in his hand, wondering if the boy who'd carved it remembered him at all, or if time had washed that summer clean. Then, in the spring of 1956, the letter arrived. It was thin, a foreign stamp. The handwriting was hesitant, as if each letter had been practiced slowly before being written down. Dear Mr. Tully, I hope this letter find you good. I am writing from Hiroshima. I am alive. My family is alive. My brother not alive. He died long ago. I am farming now. I think often of Texas, of horse, of dust, of quiet barn. I carry memory with me. Your horse, still in my dreams. There was no signature, just a folded photograph inside the envelope. It showed a small wooden carving, delicate, elegant, unmistakable. A cherry blossom, petals splayed wide. It had been carved from cedar, the grain running like veins through each petal. Tully stared at it for a long time, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. In Japan, cherry blossoms meant many things: beauty, impermanence, the fleeting nature of life. But this one meant something else, too. It meant remembrance. He pinned the photo beside the carving on the windowsill. The two pieces sat there, side by side, a horse resting, a flower blooming. Two hands, two countries, two lives that had crossed for one strange, brutal season. Tully didn't reply to the letter, not because he didn't want to, but because some things, once given, don't need answers. The prairie rolled on, wind stirring the grass like whispers. And every morning as the sun rose over the land that had seen fire, silence, and grace, Tully would glance at the window-sill and remember, not the war, but the man. When Tully died in the spring of 1978, it was quiet. No fanfare, no obituary beyond the one printed in the local weekly. Beloved rancher, veteran of the Great War, devoted caretaker of the land. His niece, Clara, came down from Amarillo to help with the house. It was mostly dust and books and old things that didn't mean much to anyone except him. She swept the porch, fed the horses, and sorted the mail still stacked in the hallway. But it was under the bed that she found the box. It was plain cedar, no lock, no hinge, just tucked in the dark like something waiting. She pulled it out, coughed at the dust, and opened the lid. Inside was a carved wooden horse, its legs folded beneath it. A photograph yellowed with age, a cherry blossom etched in soft cedar grain, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded scrap of cloth, a metal canteen engraved with small, delicate kanji. She didn't know the language, but she ran her fingers across the grooves as if the metal might whisper its meaning. Clara had always known her uncle as a quiet man, stern sometimes, but never cruel. He rarely spoke of the war. She remembered asking him once, as a child, if he'd ever killed anyone. He didn't answer, just looked out at the fields and said, "War teaches you about fire, but the real lessons come after." She didn't press him. Now, holding these pieces, she realized there was a story here, one she'd never been told. She didn't know the boy's name, didn't know about the fire or the fence or the word that had once changed everything. But she would sit her children down and show them the box. She would tell them that their great-uncle had once said the war taught him everything about what a man shouldn't be, until one prisoner showed him what a man could be. And that mattered more than medals. The horse carving sat on her mantel after that, not because she understood its full meaning, but because she didn't have to. It looked peaceful there in the soft light of morning, as if it had always belonged. The photograph she placed in a frame. She didn't hide it away. She wanted her children to grow up seeing it, asking about it. She wanted them to understand that sometimes the stories worth telling aren't the loud ones with guns and flags, but the quiet ones, the ones made of dust and wood and second chances. The canteen she kept wrapped, tucked gently in the linen drawer. She didn't want it to tarnish. Years later, her daughter would take that same box to school for a history project. When asked what it meant, she said, "It's from the war, but it's not about fighting." And maybe that was the best anyone could say. History has a way of forgetting the small things, the faces, the gestures, the days that never made the newspapers. But the land remembers. The wind carries stories long after the people are gone. And sometimes those stories rest not in books or monuments, but in the curve of a carved figure or the silent weight of a shared canteen. Tully had called it reckless once, the decision to trust. But time had rewritten that word. It hadn't been reckless at all. It had been the only sane choice in an insane time. And long after uniforms turned to dust, that choice remained. A horse at rest, a flower carved from memory, a canteen that once passed from hand to hand beneath a burning sky. A story that began with silence, endured through fire, and ended not with enemies, but with understanding.